this presentation. Presentation, as you all know, is entitled Climate Change, What It Is and How It Affects Us All. My name is Shaheen Hirji, and I'm a volunteer based in Toronto of Amnesty International. I'm with the Business and Human Rights and Indigenous Rights Group. And I'm also a board member for the Amnesty International Toronto board. And my co-host is Becca Schmidtke. And Becca is she's the chair of the Business and Human Rights and Indigenous Rights Group. And Becca is going to be moderating the Q&A session later on at the end. Let's see. Okay, so the program today, I'll just go through the program quickly. We're going to do some introductions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Fiona Koza from Amnesty International to talk a little bit about Amnesty and Amnesty's work with human rights and climate change. And then that'll be followed, obviously, by the presentation by Dr. Diane Sachs. It'll be about a 45-minute presentation. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to do a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session, which will be moderated by Becca. And so we really encourage everyone to use the chat box to share your comments and any questions that you have. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can share comments there as well. And some volunteers will try to help you. And then just a few things to note. Again, the platform that we're using today on Zoom, it does not allow us to see all of you or to hear all of you using your microphones, but we can see all your comments on the chat. So we will be watching that, and we will be bringing up questions at the end. Right. So before we start, before we start, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that the land that I'm currently on in Toronto is located on treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. This territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. And for those of you who haven't heard of that, that was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and other allied nations to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. So just as we proceed with the presentation, and I think it's very relevant to this presentation and to what we're going to be discussing, I would like to invite everyone to think about the land and territory that you are on and who the traditional keepers of this land are, everything that they have done and past generations have done to try to protect and care for this land, and also to think a little bit about what our responsibilities are and what we would like to do in terms of our responsibilities to them, to the traditional keepers, to the land, to ourselves, and to future generations now that we are here. So now I would love to introduce Fiona Koza. Fiona is Amnesty International's Business and Human Rights campaigner. She's been with Amnesty for a long time, and she's also leading our work now on climate change. So welcome, Fiona.
Thank you, Shaheen. And thank you. I'm thrilled to be here and delighted that so many of you are joining us this evening. Many people think that climate change is a new area of work for Amnesty, but we've actually been working on climate change for over a decade, although until recently, not very publicly. In 2010, for example, I was on Amnesty's delegation to the UN Climate Conference. We were lobbying the Canadian government for ambitious climate action, and I had an op-ed published on climate change and poverty as part of Amnesty's Dignity campaign. So those of you who've been with Amnesty for at least 10 years will remember all our work on dignity. So internationally, we've been collaborating with other organizations, including environmental organizations, social justice organizations, indigenous organizations that work on climate change, often taking the lead from others who have more experience, including climate-affected communities whose voices we strive to amplify. What Amnesty brings to the issue of climate change is the human rights perspective. So climate change itself impacts many human rights, including the rights to health, food, water, shelter, life, and more. And solutions to climate change may also have a human rights impact. For example, dams that are constructed without adequate consultation with Indigenous people, or electric vehicles that have batteries made of minerals mined using child labor. There are also many relevant procedural rights that are relevant to climate crisis. People have the right to information, to participate in decisions that affect them, and the right to protest. Yet many environmental defenders are harassed and threatened for their climate activism. And climate change is also a profoundly a justice issue. Although the climate crisis is a global problem affecting everybody, it disproportionately affects people and groups who are subjected to multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and to structural inequalities, particularly Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world, as well as women and girls, people in the least developed countries, who are impacted first and hardest by the climate crisis while being the least responsible for it. And that's a crucial point. Those who have done the least to cause climate change are experiencing the worst impacts. So it's the responsibility of countries like Canada that are among the worst contributors to the problem to act urgently to reduce emissions, to assist other countries, and to help people adapt to the climate impacts that are already happening. For more information about Amnesty's work on climate change, including our involvement in the carbon pricing challenge between the federal government and the provinces of Ontario and Alberta and Saskatchewan that took place in the Supreme Court last week, I encourage you to visit our climate webpage. That's www.amnesty.ca/climate. And I also encourage you to sign our new climate petition that was launched last week. And if you want to roll up your sleeves and volunteer, you could join Amnesty Canada's new Climate Justice and Corporate Accountability Specialized Team. And you'll get information about how to join this team and other ways to take action in a follow-up email after this webinar. And so now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's main guest speaker, which is Dr. Dianne Saxe. Dr. Saxe was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario from 2015 to 2019, reporting to the legislature on environment, energy, and climate, and guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights. She now heads Saxe Facts Law Professional Corporation, focusing on the climate crisis. And finally, I'd like to remind everyone that there'll be a Q&A session after Dr. Saxe's presentation. Now, over to you, Dr. Saxe.
Thank you very much, and lovely to be with everybody, and wonderful to have people from so many places. All right, let's see if I can get this working. Oops. Oops, no, not there. Sorry, hang on. There we go. All right, can you see the slides? Yes? Slides are good? All right.
Yeah, we can.
Yes. All right, thank you. So, yes, climate changes everything, I think, is a pretty fair summary, and whatever you care about climate is affecting it already, and much more ahead. If you want to be able to summarize it in just 10 words, Ed Maybach, who's one of the leading professors on climate communications, summarizes it this way: it's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, and there's hope. So you can repeat this back to me so you remember them. It's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, and there's hope. Well, those of you I could see, I know you didn't, but that's okay. So the result of what humans are doing, mostly burning fossil fuels, is we're giving the world a fever. You can see that every month in the National Center for Environmental Information, anything that's red is warmer than what we used to consider to be normal. Temperatures, ocean acidity all around the world are going just completely out of the bounds that existed during the whole time that humans have evolved. One of the big fallacies for Canadians in particular is we tend to say to each other, well, how much do we really matter? There's only 34 million of us. It's really those bad guys in China who are causing all this problem. What we do doesn't matter. And it's not true. Of the nearly 200 countries in the world, Canada is in the top 10 polluters now, and in terms of the total pollution up until now, which is driving the climate crisis. Partly that's because we have an enormous industry generating and exporting oil and gas. But it's also partly because we are incredibly wasteful. So who do you suppose drives the most climate polluting vehicles in the entire world? It's Canadians. We have really, really, really big feet. My experience is that when people get bad news, usually what they want to do is to hang on and wait for normal to come back. You hear this on the radio all the time. Well, you know, the weather's unusual. We need to get back to normal. And what people often mean by normal is roughly the average of the 20th century. That's what our insurance is designed for. It's what our laws are designed for. It's what our infrastructure is designed for. It's what our crops are designed for. And that's roughly the zero line on this chart. Now, I hope you can see we don't live there anymore. And this is just what's happened already. We know, for example, that the risk of fire in California is already twice as much as it was in the 1980s, which is not that long ago. But we know that normal can't come back, not just because of what's happened already, but because of what's locked in. We burn so many fossil fuels. 80% of the world's economy is still dependent on fossil fuels. So we have already emitted so many fossil fuels, so much greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels that we've already locked in another couple of decades of climate change. It takes about a generation between the time that we drive our cars or take a flight or, you know, buy meat or otherwise generate greenhouse gases before we really start to experience the impact. So what we've seen so far is mostly the result of the burning of fossil fuels up to a generation ago. And since that time, the rate at which we burn fossil fuels has basically doubled. Since the world signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, when all the countries of the world agreed we urgently had to reduce our burning of fossil fuels in order to have a future, we've doubled the carbon pollution in the atmosphere. So you hear people talk about new normal. There is no new normal in sight. The rate of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been going up and up every decade, faster and faster and faster. It's like seeing the Titanic out your window and putting on the steam. Let's see if we can get there as fast as possible. We know that at the end of the last ice age, there were catastrophically quick changes. And we're now growing CO2 100 times faster than at the end of the last ice age. And well, this year, we keep on breaking records, even with COVID. We broke records for the amount of carbon dioxide pollution in the atmosphere. It's only a few years since we first broke 400. So I look at this, I mean, I'm from an evidence-based profession, probably a lot of you are. And there's a lot of reasons to rely on evidence, but there's one big weakness to it. You can only get evidence from what's happened already. What happened to people the last time carbon dioxide was this high? There weren't any people. It's millions of years since there was this much CO2 in the atmosphere. So we're sailing into completely uncharted territory that humans have never existed in, and we're sailing there faster and faster every year. So the seasons have changed. In my lifetime, we've seen dramatic changes in the seasons where we live. This in the Northern Hemisphere, you can see we still get really cold weather sometimes, but on average, we have much, much more warm weather, and we have much, much more very hot weather, which creates all kinds of problems. Well, so it's not a question of if anymore. It's a question of when, it's a question of where. It's not a question of if. We add that much more heat into the atmosphere, all the natural systems on which our lives depend get upended, and they start to fluctuate, and they start to crack, and we start to see what we see in the newspapers. Now, a lot of time people think of the climate crisis as being something far away that's going to happen to other people in other places later, and mostly the polar bears. We have a bad habit, I guess, climate scientists, of writing reports that are all about 2050, 2100. I have yet to meet a politician who really gives a damn about 2100. They will not be in power in 2100. They don't expect to be alive in 2100. It is just not relevant to them. But it's relevant to today's children. My grandson was born last month. He's going to be just 29 in 2050, ready to try to set up a family of his own, to try to look after and protect them. And it's going to be enormously more difficult for him than it was for me. And he's only 79 in 2100. So when we talk about all the disasters that are coming in this century, we are talking about today's children, which is why the Special Rapporteur to the United Nations Human Rights Council put this as clearly as anybody I've heard so far. In this century, that is in the lifetime of today's children, any small person you care about, we now, the best case we can expect is widespread death and suffering. And the worst case, in the lifetime of today's children, is humanity on the brink of extinction. There aren't any bigger stakes. So we're racing into the unknown. This is our best way of summarizing what happens when we get to these different temperature ranges. 2 degrees, we're already well past 1. 2 degrees is completely outside human experience. It means meaningful physical damage is much bigger than we've seen so far, with a third of Bangladesh being flooded and California on fire. 3 degrees, and we're on track to exceed more than 3 degrees during the lifetime of today's children. Not seen for 3 million years, highly disruptive physical damages. And we could easily be at 4 degrees at the rate we're going. So the climate crisis is a threat multiplier. Whatever else you care about, and I know Amnesty people care about many things around the world, the climate crisis makes it worse. Think about the people in Bangladesh, a third of the country underwater this summer from floods, at the very same time as they're coping with the COVID epidemic. Now that makes everything harder. Do you evacuate people? Do you not evacuate people? How do you protect them from the pandemic while you're evacuating them from the floods? How do you deal with safe drinking water and people having a chance to wash their hands and provide control of the pandemic when the country is flooded? And the one thing we know for sure is that the climate crisis worsens inequality. So the emergency is coming more into focus now. If anybody ever tells you they don't know who to believe, there's a really clear answer to this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's an awkward name, I know, the IPCC. But this was set up by all the governments of the world. As I mentioned, there is an international treaty on climate. It was signed 30 years ago. And the countries of the world recognized they needed to have a consensus body for reliable science so that everybody would have a factual floor to work from. And that's what this is. It's the work of thousands of the best scientists in the world working together over decades, ferociously difficult. And then every word that they write has to be approved by the countries of the world. Imagine how difficult that is. And their reports are just utterly damning. So they do big assessment reports every few years. The next one will be in 2022. But they were asked to do 3 special reports that came out in the last 2 years, and they were absolutely heart-stopping, these special reports. The first question was, what should our target be? So the international treaty signed in 1992 says we're going to all work together to keep the increase in temperature below 2 degrees, which we are not on track to do. But it's become clear in the 30 years since then that that's probably not enough. And so the IPCC was asked, how much worse is 2 degrees than 1.5? Because the Paris Agreement, 2005, they said we're going to stay well below 2 degrees, and we're going to possible 1.5. So the IPCC was asked, how much worse is 2 degrees than 5? And the answer is, there will be large, widespread, robust differences. It is going to be much worse if we get to 2 degrees than it would be if we stayed at 1.5. And one of the critical differences is in the ability of human and natural systems to adapt. If we would stay below 1.5 degrees, which means cutting our fossil fuel use in half this decade at a minimum, then we can expect most human and natural systems to be able to cope. And if we don't, we can expect a growing number of human and natural systems to begin to collapse. particularly obvious on food, special report on land and food. The climate crisis is already affecting food quality and security. And there are very high risks at 2 degrees that we're going to see rapid declines in agricultural productivity, irreversible damage to land and ecosystems, more wildfire, more conflict, and more migration. And we see this already. The 2020 Global Report on Food Crises, already much worse in 2019 than it was the year before, and that was even before COVID. More than 10 million more people acutely food insecure, a lot of that driven by climate and by the conflicts driven by climate. Then the third report was about what's called the cryosphere, everything frozen. And the short answer is that everything frozen is melting faster and faster, much faster than really mainstream scientists thought were possible, even in 2014 when the last assessment report was released. The oceans are in crisis. And that means much more damaged coastal communities all around the world. It means soaring flood damage. It means dire water shortages. And it probably means hundreds of millions of people displaced. And we also have 1 million species at risk. And that basically the whole natural systems on which our lives depend, birds, animals, plants, they're disappearing all around the world. World Health Organization has recognized climate change as one of the biggest global health threats of this century. It combines with environmental damage, which is probably one of the causes of COVID, destroying ecosystems and driving humans into places where animals have been trying to live. So here's a summary. And we can learn some things from COVID. I mean, here's the simplest one. If we think COVID is tough, and it is, it's tiny compared to what climate change is bringing us. And with COVID, we could get a vaccine. And Bill Gates has been estimating that by the end of 2021, we could have a general purpose vaccine in general use, where we could have some possibility of a more normal life. There's nothing simple like that for climate change. It's a much, much bigger challenge. What we should learn from COVID is that our way of life is fragile. It feels so normal, the way we live. But physics, like viruses, do not compromise, and exponential growth means disaster in exactly the same way that it does for COVID. And just like COVID, vulnerable people suffer the most. New report from many people, but for example, the World Food Program. That's true within countries, and it's true between countries. The vulnerable people suffer the most. So is it too late? Well, too late for what? Is it too late to avoid having really big changes coming our way? Yes, it's too late for that. They're already starting to be here, and we've already locked in the next 20 years. But there is still a little time to avoid the worst, and our choices right now really matter, especially in wealthy, high-polluting countries like Canada. And we've had lots of notice. I mean, Popular Mechanics wrote about global warming and that burning fossil fuels were going to put up the temperature of the world in 1911. It took until 1992 to get the international treaty, but we still have paid no attention and still have doubled our fossil fuel use even since then. And we have so many benefits from reducing fossil fuels. I mean, almost all of the Sustainable Development Goals are promoted by reducing fossil fuels, cleaner air, decent work, all the sort of things that most of us are trying to work for. So what can we do? Well, for everyone at every level, these are 3 things we have to do. We need to reduce our personal footprints, for sure. We need to get ready to adapt because the changes are here and more are coming, and we must speak up. For Canadians in particular, this seems to be the most un-Canadian thing to do, is to talk about climate and to talk about it without getting tired, without getting bored, without getting embarrassed. We cannot leave climate just to governments. So Individual action matters, absolutely, for sure. This climate pollution was my very last report the day before my office was abolished, and gives the stats for people in Ontario. I know a few of you are from Ontario. On average, emissions in Ontario, and on average for people in Ontario, half of our direct pollution comes from just 4 things. Driving, remember we drive the most climate polluting vehicles in the world. Heating leaky homes, flying, well maybe not so much of that this year, and eating meat. These amount to half the footprint, and the climate pollution from individuals is bigger than the pollution from industries. But another thing we can think about, and you can use this acronym THINK, is to think about money. So Bill McKibben wrote a stupendous article last September in the New Yorker that money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. And he's absolutely right that one of the most powerful things that most people can do is to put some pressure on their financial institutions. If you have a pension or you pay into a pension, well, the Canada Pension Plan, for example, is one of the dirtiest pension plans in Canada. Heavy investors in fossil fuel expansion. If you have a bank account anywhere, have you talked to the bank manager about their climate policies, or just fired your bank and gone to something like Desjardins? We can do a lot by putting pressure on the financial institutions because they do an enormous amount to prop up the fossil fuel industries, and they don't need to. So individual action is important. Everybody can do something, but it is not enough. It is not nearly enough to make the kind of differences that we need. Collective problems need collective action. That's what governments were invented for. And the 3 big things that governments can do: make polluters pay, invest in solutions, and regulate the sources of contaminants. And those are things that they can do that the rest of us can't do. So we really must speak up. So here's another thing I'm going to ask you to memorize. So please actually say this back to me. And Shaheen, I'm looking at you. Everybody, say this back to me, even though I can't hear you. Simple, clear messages. Say it with me. Simple, clear messages. Repeated often by a variety of trusted voices.
By a variety of trusted voices.
So these are 11 magic words to learn, again, from Ed Maybach. This is how we reach other people. This is how we change minds. Simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. So who's a trusted voice? Well, you're going to be a trusted voice in some community, but you know people who are trusted voices. So the most trusted profession in the world, according to Veracity, is nurses. And doctors and vets and other medical professions are pretty close behind them. So do you know a nurse or a doctor? Can you encourage them to speak up about climate? What about a religious institution? Faith institutions play a really important role in many communities and have an explicitly moral goal. And this is a moral challenge. Every faith community should be speaking up about it. And a lot of them have nice words but aren't taking action. Can you help make that happen? Can you join a green community?